I'm going to pass over to you, Chris, thanking our previous panels, General McMaster and General Allen again for their participation. And the next panel is focused on the domestic drivers of this new disinformation space. So Chris, thank you so much.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you to all the panelists on the first panel for such a rich discussion, which added some clearly needed and vital nuance and historical perspective to the role and history of Russian propaganda, in particular in the 2016 election. What we're going to try and do in this panel is pick up where the first one left off by adding some nuance and understanding of the domestic drivers of disinformation. Immediately after the last election, there was a sense that disinformation was really a foreign policy problem, and that it was something that happened to the US as opposed to something that arose at least in part out of what was already happening within our domestic politics and society. Yet if the last 4 years have revealed nothing else, I think most recently in the extraordinary and unprecedented presidential debate earlier this week, I think it's that we can no longer ignore the domestic trends and forces driving disinformation in the US. And fortunately, to discuss those trends and drivers, we have a genuinely extraordinary group of esteemed colleagues with us this morning, including Renee DiResta, the research manager at the Stanford Internet Observatory, who has been doing cutting-edge research on social media for many years now. For those who haven't read it, I would also flag Renee's article in The Atlantic last spring called "The Conspiracies Are Coming from Inside the House," which is easily one of the best pieces I've read on the confluence of factors driving the rise of disinformation in American politics, and one that I will be sure to flag online once the panel wraps. In addition, we're also thrilled to be joined this morning by my fantastic colleague, Elaine Kmark, who is a senior fellow in the Governance Studies program at Brookings and the founding director of our Center for Effective Public Management. Even more, I'll add that she is also one of the keenest and most insightful observers of American politics out there, as evidenced by her most recent book, Primary Politics, which I cannot recommend highly enough for those of you trying to understand how our presidential politics have arrived at this point. And finally, we're also joined today by Dr. Kate Starbird, an associate professor at the University of Washington and director of the Emerging Capabilities of Mass Participation Laboratory. As with Renee, I would also add that Dr. Starbird has also been at the forefront of social media research for years and has written extensively on how disinformation emerges and spreads online. So Renee, Elaine, and Kate, thank you so much for being here this morning and for joining us for such an important conversation. To kick things off, I want to start off with some level setting on the issue by asking each of you this, starting with Renee. In your view, what were the key drivers of disinformation in 2016 and how, if at all, have they changed in 2020?
Thank you. Thanks for that great intro, Chris. So I think what we saw in 2016 was a sustained operation that wasn't even focused on the election. I think that's one of the common misconceptions, that it was election focused. It actually began back in 2014. And so that desire to use this new tool, to experiment with it, to undermine American kind of societal cohesion really began much earlier. The election it happened to kind of fall into that time frame, but it wasn't the primary goal. But I would say that 4 years ago, a lot of the messaging really had to do with driving a loss of confidence in democracy, the idea of democratic systems. And the Russian Internet Research Agency had to work pretty hard at that, right? So they segmented American society, they created a whole lot of different groups, and then they inflected messages to each of these groups to try to drive division between them, but really to entrench them in their own political or cultural identity. And the common theme, one of the common themes between them was that the American society was rigged, and it was always rigged against your group. So if you were a white person in the South, there were the Confederate statue debates that were happening at that time. The statues were coming down. That meant that people were destroying your heritage. If you were African American, systemic racism meant that America was against you. They even took it down to really like low-key niche things, football games where, people were cheating, the stock market was rigged against you, primaries, polls, the media, everything was rigged against everybody at all times. And what was interesting was when the 2020 primary started this year, what we started to see was those narratives about rigging being spread by domestics instead. I think that was one of the really key changes, and I imagine that we'll talk a little bit more about what we're seeing in 2020 later. But it was that idea of who is America for? What is American society? What does it mean to be American? And then how is American society rigged against your group?
Thanks, Renee. I think that's kind of one of the key challenges that we're still trying to grapple with, right? Is what are the the kind of politics of grievance and marginalization, and how they're kind of intersecting online. Kate, I want to turn back to you now with the same question. What were some of the key drivers that you were observing in your research in 2016?
Yeah, I would love to actually show you all, because I spend a lot of time in the social media data, and I want to get a chance to maybe show you all a little bit about what that looks like and maybe give some insight about what might have been happening there. So let me see if that's going to work. Oh my goodness. So this is, oh no, that's not what I want. This is actually a graph that is, sorry, one second. So this is a graph that we spent some time with as in my research lab. Actually, before the election, we were starting to build this research to look at the Black Lives Matter conversation that was happening in 2016. And what we saw there was a very polarized conversation. So this is a graph of Twitter. Each little dot is a Twitter account, and they're closer together when they retweeted each other and farther apart when they didn't. And what we actually saw were two very different spheres of accounts interacting with each other. Very little interaction between them except yelling at each other. And so it was like a structural representation of polarization. The conversation was very polarized. In this case, pro-Black Lives Matter on the left and anti-Black Lives Matter on the right. We also later learned that this conversation was one of the primary conversations targeted by the Internet Research Agency in 2016. And actually prior, they had started building up their intersections with this conversation. And when we look at, boy, this is slow today. So when we look at actually how they targeted it, these orange lines are actually accounts that were Internet Research Agency accounts, and they were retweeted, and to show you how they were retweeted by others in other accounts that were likely real Americans, many of them in this conversation. And what we actually see is this polarization that we had in the space was something that they targeted. They didn't create the polarization, but we were vulnerable inside that polarization, and they integrated. And you can actually, this is a representation, it may not be perfect, but you can kind of see a metaphor here of them. They're not in the middle of each of these groups. They're on the outsides, kind of pulling them apart. So they sought to sort of amplify the structural loss of common ground that we already had, and tried to pull us apart in that way. Sorry. Trying to get a stop share here. All right, and so when we look at, why we're vulnerable, part of why we're vulnerable is that sort of that polarization, that loss of common ground. Also, I think there is a vulnerability in our information systems. We have displaced gatekeepers, a new set of influencers that people go to for information, and we're vulnerable for people kind of getting into those, becoming those influencers, and sometimes people that have different kinds of motivations. Another piece of that vulnerability we saw was the kind of alternative media ecosystem, where people are turning to conspiracy theories and finding, websites that look like something that they can trust, that are coming from foreign groups, domestic ones alike, that are spreading certain kinds of information that can lead people into this kind of distrust that Renee's been talking about. And now the tools and techniques of disinformation aren't just available to foreign governments, they're also available to everyone, and being picked up by domestic and foreign governments, or domestic activists and foreign governments alike. One of the things I know Thomas has talked about a lot is how activism and active measures are kind of blurred. And we're seeing domestic operations resonate with foreign ones, and self-motivated activists begin to echo and even seed and spread disinformation themselves. And so for me, that a lot of what we're seeing right now going into this election is that a lot of what we're seeing is domestic. Similar kinds of things and networks that we were studying that were related to Russia in 2016. What we're seeing now mostly, I think, is domestic, and probably we were seeing mostly domestic stuff in 2016, but it was easier to problematize the Russian disinformation when really we have all these different kinds of information operations happening in our own space. The disinformation is collaborative and participatory and networked. It's not just something that's happening to us, it's something in some ways that we're doing to ourselves. And the networks are sort of wired to spread disinformation. We can see these networks that have developed in some ways by gaming the system, but now they're wired so, you know, a piece of information that's opportunistic for them hits the system, and then all of a sudden it spreads very quickly and very far. And we're seeing these two complementary forces of things arriving from the margins of the internet and then coming out through the influencers. And so we see this sort of margins in and also top down. We're seeing disinformation coming from our own political leaders, especially disinformation that seeks to further undermine trust in our democratic election process. And so I think all of these kind of integrating forces, foreign and domestic, activists and active measures, make it a very messy space to be studying and very complicated, and something I think even as researchers, we still don't have our heads fully wrapped around it.
That's embarrassing. So we're going to come back to the point about the alternative kind of media ecosystem and how, you know, the fringes of the internet can work in tandem with some of those alternative media sites, and then kind of port over into mainstream media in a bit, because I think that's one of the key things that is really not as well understood as it should be, and it is a key factor in what's going on. But before we go there, I want to bring in Elaine. You had a remarkable piece earlier this week after the debate, in which you kind of talked a bit about the strangeness of the debate. I'm curious, you know, you've also provided a tremendous amount of commentary as well in 2016 and its aftermath about some of the strangeness of the disinformation there. And I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit about, you know, what you saw as happening in 2016 and how you see it playing out now.
Well, thank you, Chris, and it's great to be on. I can't wait to read some of your work, my co-panelists here. This will be fun. Listen, 2016 was a perfect storm, okay? What happened in 2016 was you had a brand new element in a political campaign that political campaigns themselves were not at all familiar with, which is this massive amount of disinformation. It was particularly effective in two dimensions: one with African-American voters, and two with supporters of Bernie Sanders. And it's clear from, we now know from the Mueller investigations and the indictments that, that the Russians were very conscious of wanting to focus on African-American voters and Bernie Sanders supporters and try to make sure that they were not united for Hillary Clinton. So that's one part of it. The second part of the perfect storm is that it was a very close race in 3 states. And that nobody really saw coming. The polling did not pick that up at all. The polling got the national numbers just about right, but they didn't get the 3 states right. And the third, and so let me just give you a little bit of data on one of those states, Michigan. In Detroit, okay, Wayne County, the Hillary Clinton vote was 70,000 votes short of what Obama had done in 2012. Now, initially everybody said, oh, she wasn't Black. Oh, you know, no wonder, of course, it dropped off, et cetera. You know what Trump's margin was in the state of Michigan was 10,000 votes. Okay, so there was something was happening there with the African-American vote, which has been very loyal to Democrats who weren't Black. Al Gore got a large African-American vote. John Kerry got a large African-American vote. Something else was happening there. So that's the second piece of the perfect storm. The third piece was that we had a Clinton campaign that had almost overlearned the lessons of the Obama campaign, which was to use data, make models, have algorithms, et cetera. People with experience in campaigns who had no idea what a damn algorithm was, were telling the campaign all along. You're in trouble in Michigan. You're in trouble in Michigan. You're in trouble in Wisconsin. You're in trouble in Pennsylvania, the 3 states that cost Hillary Clinton the election. The campaign was a campaign that relied on data, which of course all campaigns in this day and age do. But what it did is it did that at the expense of picking up something that was going on the ground. There was not the traditional heavy person-to-person campaign being run, particularly in the Black neighborhoods of Detroit, Milwaukee, usually. So in other words, not all the silly nonsense out there about Hillary Clinton and Pizzagate and, all the stuff that the Russians were pushing out, there was no counter, right? The people sitting in Brooklyn said, oh, that's ridiculous, right? Who would believe that? Well, guess what? Some people did believe it. So you had this sort of perfect storm of not enough on the ground to combat it. First time, as we know from war, right? The first time you use a weapon, it surprises everyone. It's the most effective. Looking forward, I don't think that people will be taken by surprise again with this quantity of disinformation coming out. And it's not surprising to me that they have switched that the Republicans, and then echoed by the Russians, have switched the focus of their disinformation from trying to make up stupid stuff about Joe Biden to trying to confuse people about the vote and strike at the heart of the legitimacy of the election. And I think that all the stuff the president tweets sometimes 4 times a day about mail-in ballots, okay? And that's an effort to kind of get people confused about how to vote and what's safe and is this really going to matter, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that we've got a slightly different challenge this time, but the challenge is still there.
I would certainly agree with you that the challenge is very much there. Renee, I want to come back to you. You talked a bit about what you saw in 2016. Are there, in terms of what you're seeing now in 2020, are you seeing similar things to what Elaine was just describing, or are there other trends that you're picking up on too?
Yeah, so the adversarial tactics evolve, right? If you think about the internet as a system, if you think about the social network and the blogosphere and broadcast media, which also now has internet as a channel, as the ecosystem changes, as platforms change the rules of the game, now you have to verify ads in certain ways. It's a little bit harder to create a fake account. There's a lot more attention paid to that. When the platforms change the rules of the game, you see the tactics evolve in response, so that there is always this, kind of fluid, new and exciting developments that come up. I'll point to Facebook Live, for example, as a brand new product front that didn't exist 4 years ago. Live and the Watch tab, where you can just go and it'll begin to stream videos at you. This has been a very interesting tool for people to live stream protest movements, right? And there are many channels that now kind of have a number of different Twitch streams, and they just kind of pick the most sensational one, push it out to Facebook Live. And so if you turn on if you find yourself in that media ecosystem or you follow any of these pages, what you have is a nightly feed of unrest, which is a really interesting dynamic. And what that allows an adversary to do is to amplify that idea that America is burning. There's absolute chaos in the streets everywhere. Even if when you actually go and click in, it's like 5 guys on a corner in Portland yelling at somebody, right? So the difference, now that watch tab is there, now that this video option is there, you can again create this sense of chaos at all times. And so what we're seeing from Russia now is you have Ruptly, which is their news service that is always broadcasting. Every single protest Ruptly is broadcasting, and it's inflected a certain way if you're watching it through RT, and it's inflected a different way if you're watching it through Redfish or through In the Now or Soapbox. RT is taking a much more right wing, look at these protesters, they're looting, there's violence, and Redfish and In the Now are taking a left wing kind of tack to it, which is look at these evil police officers. So when you have that dynamic, depending on which channel you're watching, it's identical footage, but it's being inflected in 2 different ways. And this is, again, a feature set, a misinformation front that didn't exist 4 years ago. So the adversary is not only updating their narratives, they're updating their tactics. When it comes to the narratives, though, what they're able to do is just take what we are putting out. And I would say that 4 years ago, we did see Russia, we did see the Internet Research Agency trolls finding every single incident they could in the week leading up to Election Day and on Election Day. Here's a touchscreen voter machine that is misbehaving, right? Whoa, voter fraud. Here is an allegation from a random individual on Twitter. Amplify it, retweet it, as many times as you can to create the sense that the election is illegitimate. I think, though, at the time, 4 years ago, the national, our kind of where we were as a culture, weren't as receptive to that narrative. The idea that we could have a completely, illegitimate election was not a thing that Americans believed. Whereas I think that now, particularly with prominent influencer delegitimization, feeding that narrative, constantly creating it, what happens when you create one of these long-term narratives is that people, it's always in the back of their mind, they hear it. And so when new information comes out, when a new ballot is found, in a garbage somewhere, there's a photograph of something, or, there's a secret recorded video claim, whether selectively edited or not, people take those individual moments and they connect them together into this broader narrative. And so now we are receptive to this idea that the election is potentially going to be contested, that there is going to be, certain segments of the American population have been hearing from extremely prominent figures that they trust in their media environment that the Democrats are stealing the election from them. And so this is the mindset that they have going into it now, as opposed to 4 years ago, where that wasn't happening. And that wasn't that wasn't a thing that we felt was in the realm of the plausible. So what Russia has the ability to do now is, rather than put out that content itself and try to spark it, from, start the fire from, from sticks, the fire is already burning. All they have to do is put oxygen on it.
It's a great analogy. And I think hopefully at the end of the panel, we can come out and turn to how to put that fire out. But first, I want to talk a little bit more about why it's burning. We got a lot of audience questions in advance of this event, and they kind of all touched on different drivers that I think we've talked about already, some of the political drivers, the media drivers, the tech drivers. And I want to just try and tease them apart a little bit. Starting with the kind of tech ecosystem that we have right now and what its impact is. How much of this problem, is it specific to, individual platforms? Is it bigger than that? I know, Kate, like you had a great paper. It wasn't on American disinformation, but I think it was on Syria and some of the cross-platform disinformation that we had there. But I'd be curious, starting with you, Kate, and then Renee and Elaine can jump in. Like, how much of this is a problem of the internet writ large versus specific platforms? And what are the trends that we're seeing in technology that really are driving this?
So this is a huge, it's actually a really
huge question.
It has a couple different pieces, right?
Yeah,
when we go do research, we may be looking at one platform and it's often Twitter because the data is public. And we're just getting this tiny piece of what's going on. The disinformation problem, it's foreign domestic, right? But when you think about what's mediating it, it's every way we get information. It's every social media platform is susceptible and shapes the disinformation in different kinds of ways. Like YouTube is a place to put the content, and then that content can sit there, and then people on Twitter will mobilize that content opportunistically to distract from something, or push a new narrative, or resurface old video and make it look like it came from today. And then that goes through Twitter for a while, and it reaches some influencers, and it might actually reach like accounts of presidents of different countries who will push it out. And then it goes into Facebook, and it reaches everyday people who are using that, thinking that they're getting their social interactions, and so it becomes wrapped in a social wrapper. And so we've got all of these different platforms functioning to mediate this in different ways. And on top of that, we try to think of like, or media is somehow separate. Well, journalism is all over Twitter. That's where they do a lot of their communicating. That's where they promote their articles, and that's where they get a lot of their content that they're talking about. And so that's shaping the conversation. And then meanwhile, like cable news, television, other kinds of things, they're on Twitter. They're promoting things. We can show cable news pundits helping to amplify what turns out to be disinformation over and over and over again. And then that comes out in, that can come out of their Twitter accounts, but often it comes out of their nightly news shows. And so these things are all integrating where we have now this kind of system that's wired to spread disinformation. And unfortunately, from the view that I started to see this as, It's not like we can go just take one system out of the equation or just change one feature of Twitter or add a label on Facebook. The way it's developed, because these groups and entities were able to game the system, and because of the way it worked and the polarization and how people formed networks and who they began to look for as influencers and who has the larger crowd, this is now structured. The structure of the internet is wired to spread disinformation in all of these different ways. And so it makes the problem a lot harder. It's not like if we went back to 2010 and redesigned the whole thing, we might be able to stop this from happening. But what we do here to make a change is very different than what it would have looked like to have designed something differently from the beginning.
That's a great point, Kate. I don't know if Renee or Elaine want to jump in, or
well, let me make a point to put it a little bit in context. We can track today's disinformation, as Kate said. I mean, particularly on Twitter, there has always been disinformation in campaigns. Okay, we just didn't see it. So, for instance, it used to be that there were mass mailings, unidentified, no source mailings that would go out to hundreds and thousands of people before the election, sometimes printing scurrilous things about the candidate. In the South Carolina primary, where John McCain was running against George Bush, there was a mailing that went out. This was kind of a pre-internet day, saying that John McCain had an illegitimate African-American daughter. John McCain, and with a picture. And John McCain does have a Black daughter, but she's Bangladeshi and she was adopted by him and Cindy McCain. So that went out. The Bush campaign said, hey, we don't know anything about it. Probably they didn't, in fact. It was just a group sending out this stuff. So we've always had these things going on. Obviously, the extent of it and the ability to penetrate because of the internet is enormous. And the irresponsibility, frankly, of the mainstream press to pick up on these things. And I think in some way, maybe some were irresponsible. I think a lot of them were just naive and not understanding what was happening to them, and that they have to be really much, much more careful about looking at what they see reported over the internet. And again, I think this is a maturation process. And 2016 was the first election we had that was really influenced by the new technology in a major way. And I think that the voters, or I hope that the voters, will get a little bit more sophisticated as time goes on, as will the press, as will mainstream press. Now, let me add one other thing I want to add here. Reality does matter, okay? Reality really does matter, okay? The internet is this world with a lot of nonsense in it. Reality does matter. And let me give you an example that told to me by a political consultant named Sergio Bendixen, a long time ago, who worked in Latin America. And he was on a panel that I was on, and somebody asked him, well, how did you win conspiracy theories about it, et cetera? But the fact of the matter is, people know people who are dying. People know people who are sick. Now, the president of the United States also does. And so, there is a reality factor here that when it's so big, a lot of this stuff is noise below the surface. And I think that's sort of what we're seeing in this time. That doesn't mean that if we ever get back to a normal life and a normal politics, that these things won't matter at the margins, as they did in Pennsylvania, as they did in Michigan, as they did in Wisconsin 4 years ago.
Can I make one clip? I just want to push back on one thing there, and I think maybe tie a couple things together that are really interesting. So reality is such a fascinating word, in part because of the social consensus function, right? For non-falsifiable claims, reality is what you are seeing, and do you trust the person who's saying it, right? And if you are in your community and you're having a discussion about particular things, and the information that you see is coming from people who are just like you, who believe the same thing you do, who are reinforcing these claims, this is how we get to QAnon, where for them, reality is the president is fighting a vast cabal of pedophiles, right? And so the thing that I have found fascinating, I mean, my background's in tech, it's not in sociology. So the reality of social construct has been a thing that I've had mixed feelings about. But But what I think is happening in the early days of the internet, there was disinformation, right? There's always been disinformation. We can just call it propaganda, a variant of kind of dark propaganda. And at the time, though, it was decentralized. So two things I think have happened that have really changed that, just technological structures. The first are the tools to facilitate virality, which make people active participants in the propaganda process, meaning you click the share button, you have just facilitated a message, you have just forwarded on a message. So not only are you creating it, but you are an active integral part in its spread. It's fundamentally participatory now. That has never been, en masse, we've never had that power as individuals before. The second is curation algorithms. So when the internet went from this decentralization, everybody had a blog, to centralized on social platforms, which we can, there's a variety of reasons why that technology became so appealing to people. Ultimately, what happened was the glut of information meant that the platform had to curate it in some way, which is how we got recommendation, trending, and curation features, which is to break through the noise and to capture human attention. We created these systems that pushed content to people. So even if you've never proactively sought it out, it finds you because there's a profile of kind of who you are. And the curation piece is really fascinating because it is, in fact, in my opinion, that process of recommending content proactively to people means that that's how you push people into certain, what I call bespoke realities, right? You push them into communities where what they see, what they talk about, the media that they trust, and the media has at this point fragmented as well, right? So it's no longer just we're all seeing the same 10 channels or even just the channels on cable television. We have the rise of the fifth estate and the kind of micro influence to have the reach of the media without necessarily the same commitment to journalistic integrity or responsibility. And those are the people who have trust within these kind of little tiny communities, this like archipelago of realities, if you will, as opposed to one central consensus point. And that, I think, is what's really happening here as far as the intersection between the internet as infrastructure, as communication infrastructure, and how we receive propaganda today.
I'm the tech guy who can't unmute. It's really embarrassing. Kate, I know you talked earlier about some of those same trends, like the participatory nature of disinformation today, and the way that that's kind of intersecting with some of the new algorithms that we've seen, like the recommendation algorithms, curation algorithms. Would you mind talking a little bit more about how you view that phenomenon?
Well, I think Renee described it really well. And I kind of mentioned it in my opening statements, but I went through it quickly. Yeah. We tend to, when you think about the stories of 2016 and Russian propaganda, we have this idea of this foreign adversary who's manipulating us and sending us messages, and we're absorbing them. And the reality of propaganda, the reality of disinformation is that it looks much different than that. Even in 2016, they weren't just sending the message. Those messages were getting picked up. They were getting amplified. They were getting repeated and remixed by people in the U.S. who were spreading them as their own, thinking that they were their own as well, right? So, and then if you take Russia out of the system and look at some of the domestic propaganda we're seeing today, Renee mentioned it up front. We've been working on some projects in collaboration, so maybe that's why we're converging on these same topics. But if you look at the meta narratives about distrusting the election process this year, especially on mail-in ballots, we can see a lot of individuals who have bought into those meta narratives. They've heard them, and then when they receive something that doesn't look right at their house, they take a picture of it, put it on the internet, and the thing goes viral. Usually through a same kind of similar set of accounts that were sort of wired to spread this stuff to support that meta narrative. And then they come back 3 days later and be like, well, actually, that wasn't actually a ballot. The ballots haven't gone out yet. That was an information card that I received or something else, right? So they're getting it wrong, but they didn't even know that in the moment. So they're motivated. They actually believe this stuff. They believe that this content is the stuff that they're seeing shows that there's evidence of this thing they've heard about, the massive voter fraud, and they're highly motivated, and they're politically active. They feel like this is the way that they can make change and they can help or whatever, and so that becomes part of the disinformation ecosystem. And right now, I think that's a large part, is sort of this organic participation, and then these groups that are motivated to make that a big story, right? And so how it moves from the individual who's taking that picture in through sort of these minor level influencers that are mostly social media influencers, and then into sort of hyper-partisan media, and eventually through cable news media, is something, it's a pattern we're seeing over and over and over again. But it's just kind of, it's just an example of what we think of as like participatory propaganda, participatory disinformation. And I think when we start thinking about disinformation more along those lines, we're going to get a better understanding of the problem. It's not them, it's us.
It's a great way of putting it. And I want to pull, you and Renee did just such a great job of kind of explaining, how the participatory nature of social media and online interactions kind of allows these things to spread. But then it eventually does reach this point where it kind of percolates into mainstream media or broadcast media. And I know earlier in the initial session of this event, H.R. McMaster kind of spent a little bit of time talking about some of the failures, and I think he even used the word collapse almost of mainstream media in 2016. And Elaine, I want to come back to you on that point. I know you had brought it up earlier too. Like, what in your view is the role of the media in 2020, like mainstream media, and kind of what does it look like to do that responsibly in light of the disinformation that's out there, and in light of the fact that some of it's coming from elected officials that they have an obligation to report on?
Well, look, I think the most difficult thing for all of us who try to do research on this and try to differentiate now versus what's a sort of permanent trend is Donald J. Trump. Okay. We have never had a president who so consistently lies and picks up on conspiracy theories. I mean, you just can't imagine. You can't imagine, Marco Rubio doing this. You can't imagine Ted Cruz doing this. I mean, Donald Trump is way out there. And so the question that I don't know the answer to is, when Donald Trump is no longer president, will the ecosystem of the internet have the same ability to traffic in disinformation that it does now? Will it be as powerful? What we have going on here is, the press has to cover what the president says. I mean, umpteen reporters have said to me, yeah, he's the president, we have to report what he says. And so they're constantly add to the ecosystem and the uniqueness of this president. Just the other day, there's a study done, and I can't remember by who, that the biggest source of misinformation on COVID-19, it's not the Russians, it's not QAnon, it's Donald Trump. Okay, so the question, what makes it hard for researchers, and I know I've written books on the presidency, my colleague at Harvard, David Gergen, and I have had this discussion many times, which is, we don't know what to write about this guy, right? Because he is so out of the ordinary. He is so on the extreme of behavior on every aspect of presidential behavior that we just don't know what to say about him, because we don't know if the presidency is going to be forever changed, and we don't know what comes after. So I have a hard time sort of differentiating this whole discussion about disinformation from the extraordinary role that the president of the United States plays in promoting disinformation.
It's a great point. I think that kind of leads into one of the questions that I was going to ask a little bit tongue of cheek, but like if Donald Trump never gets The Apprentice on NBC, right, and he's never in a position to even kind of run for office, early in last decade, do we still have the same problem? And I'll start with you, Elaine, but Renee and Kate can jump in as well. Like, how much of this is really kind of Trump driven, and how much of it is more about some of the other forces in our tech and politics?
Chris, I don't know. Okay, I don't know, and
fair enough.
I don't think we will know until it's over and we've passed into something else. Okay, because as I say, look, my colleague Daryl West and I, you know Daryl, we wrote a short ebook last summer called Dirty Tricks in Cyberspace. Okay. And we started that with a compilation of all the dirty tricks there's been in politics in the 20th century. And there's been a ton of them. Okay. So in other words, you don't need the internet to cheat, lie, and steal. Okay. It makes it maybe cheaper, maybe a little easier, but it's not critical. And so I don't know the answer to that. And let me, just a little bit off, but since I have two great researchers here, I want to give you maybe a research project. I am looking at the COVID-19 rates in North Dakota and South Dakota, which are off the charts. Okay. And those are two places that are hardcore Trump states. They will go for Trump. There's lots of Trump supporters there. And South Dakota was the site of that 250,000 person motorcycle rally dominated by lots of people with Trump flags on it and nobody wearing masks. And, you got to think there might be some relationship to 250,000 people coming in from all over the country and the fact that not wearing masks and going into coffee shops and campgrounds, et cetera, and the spread that's going on now. I'm going to be very curious to see what the polling shows in North and South Dakota and what the deviation from the normal Republican vote is in North and South Dakota, because this goes back to Renee's question about reality, right? What is the impact of reality? And I'm thinking that might be an interesting little test to have a look at.
Kate, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I want to get back to some of the question here that you asked last time of like, what happens when Donald Trump is gone, or and well, is it just him? And I guess I have a little bit of a different perspective here. I think Elaine's right. We can't know. We're never going to know. This is some of the hard things. It's like you can't take this out of the system or that. But in some ways, I've often thought that someone like Donald Trump acquiring power in this media environment is almost a symptom rather than a cause. And that it reflects some of the weaknesses that we have related to how information began to spread and related to how someone could rise in a lot of visibility and the ways that sort of our ways of thinking about the world were turning into more conspiracy theorizing, and how he took advantage of that and how he was able to reflect that back to folks. And I think one piece of evidence to support that is it's not just happening here in the United States. It's happening in other countries, in India and the Philippines and Hungary and Brazil, that leaders like this are acquiring power, often using some of the same kinds of tools of the media. Populist figures are gaining power all over the world. And maybe that's conditions of the underlying conditions of wealth disparities and other kinds of things that are happening. But I do think that there's something there that I'm not convinced that this is a complete aberration of a single person as much as something more structurally wrong. Or something that's made us vulnerable to turning to leadership like this.
It may also have something to do with what narratives spread and what commands attention in the age of information glut, right? It's clickbait, it's sensationalism, it's conspiracy, it's things where you're like, well, let me go click on that. That's interesting sounding. Even those of us who write, thinking about what headline do you put on your article? You can't put something boring. Have some crazy claim, and I think that that's actually quite destructive. And I think that it lends itself in some ways to the way that that sort of populist leaders have always operated throughout history. Just these, we have certain people who don't feel as constrained to hew to facts. Right. And that I think is, again, as Kate said, more of a symptom of what gets amplified in this type of environment, as opposed to, a cause, I guess.
It's also,
Kate, were you going to jump in again?
Yeah, just the ability of a populist leader to have that direct connection with their audiences, where the audiences can actually feed them with the messages, and they could so quickly reflect that back to the audiences. That dynamic just supports this kind of rise of a populist leader in a way that I think, and these aren't just my ideas. I've read these kinds of ideas coming out of people who've been talking about the Philippines and the media environment there. But I also think that it's reflective of what we're seeing here. This kind of information system just works very well to support populist leadership. And it's a theory. We can't completely prove it, but it seems to have some support in some of the things that we're seeing.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing up the kind of global perspective to this. I can never kind of wrap my head around whether we should be, whether I should feel optimistic or pessimistic about the fact that we're not the only ones going through this. But I'm really glad that you brought that up. I'm conscious of time, and we've only got about 10 minutes or so left. And I think, one of the things that we're keen to do with this event is, really kind of walk through the full arc of the problem. So we had the first panel on the history of propaganda, and this panel has been focusing more on the drivers. The next panel will be more on some of the solutions. And I kind of want to just move into that solution space a little bit as a way of segueing to the next panel. And I'm sure you all have ideas about, not just what's going on, but what to do about it. Again, a lot of the questions we got were actually about this issue. And one of the questions that I'll start with, or there was actually a series of questions really related to kind of regulation and policy, right? Which is kind of in the wheelhouse of kind of immediate places you would go, although there's some concerns and challenges, obviously, with kind of easy regulatory fixes to this. But I wanted to just open it up to the group if folks do have any kind of strong thoughts about, is this a matter of just fixing Section 230, whatever that might mean? Or is it, like, what are the policy options for dealing with this? Again, anybody can jump in.
Well, I'll start with one that is unrelated to the internet. Okay. One of the reasons that Donald Trump is president is because the American political parties over the period of the last 50 years gave up their ability to control their nomination process. And they did that by what looked like increasing democratization, and everybody kind of got behind it. Oh yeah, we should have primaries. Well, in the old days, which did give us with those bad smoke-filled rooms, et cetera, but we did get Eisenhower and we did get, Roosevelt and people like that. In the old days, people nominated the president who actually knew something about him or her. And when you move to a system totally of primaries and you take out the political establishment, which we have done, and this is a very unpopular thing to say, by the way, okay, when you take out the political establishment, what you do is you leave the process open to demagogues. You leave the process open to reality television types. You open it up to all sorts of mischief. And one cannot imagine Donald Trump being nominated in the old system. And in fact, there's an analogy there. In the early 1900s, Henry Ford, very popular at the time, everybody in America was either had a Ford or was trying to buy one or wishing they could buy one. Henry Ford decided he wanted to run for president. And the Republican Party said, nah, no, go away. We're not going to nominate you. Okay. So that is completely broken down. We have had in the 21st century, a bunch of bozos deciding that they were going to run for president with no apparent reason, no apparent public stature behind them or quality of public engagement, et cetera. And the political parties gave up their role, both parties, Democrats and Republicans. Now that's a long history, which is in my book, which thank you for mentioning, Chris, but that's where we are. So one thing that we have to do is just like we need some kind of gatekeeper, frankly, back. And that's what political parties have traditionally done. And we don't do it anymore, and it's gonna give us a lot of problems in the future.
I think tech on the sort of systemic issues we've been discussing. I'm a little bit skeptical of what kind of regulation would come through Congress right now, in large part because while everybody is talking about how we need to regulate tech, the Democrats and the Republicans are united in that, but fundamentally believe in completely different outcomes that they want to see, right? Even content moderation is the best example of that. The fight over 230 says on one side, everybody wants to reform 230. One side wants more takedowns and more moderation. The other side believes that any takedown at all is an affront to free speech. So I think that calls for regulation from Congress right now are not going to really return anything that is quality. The executive orders are even worse. I do believe in self-regulation to some extent. You know, I am out here in Silicon Valley, and I think that particularly in the process that I was describing, where I said that anytime a feature change happens, it changes the state of play. I think that while you need regulatory oversight, the entity best adept, the entities best adept at kind of keeping control over disinformation campaigns in real time are actually the platforms. And what I would like to see, I think, as I mentioned, I feel like virality and curation are kind of the two of the major drivers in the problems that we have today. And so with virality, you can introduce some friction into the system. Twitter put out something yesterday just saying that early pilots that they've done indicate some success in giving someone a prompt that just says, are you sure you want to retweet this? You haven't read the article, right? You didn't, are you hate sharing the title, or did you actually go and look at this? And are you making a conscious decision that this is a message that you want to participate in facilitating? So I think that there are design tweaks that you can make that add in some friction and do a little bit to mitigate the impact of virality. And then on the curation front, that is, I think, really, I believe that curation, information curation, is the problem facing us in the information environment today. We used to have the gatekeepers doing it, as Kate alluded to. When that went away, now it's kind of the sort of wholly algorithmic curation. You are starting to see, particularly for 2020, platforms beginning to layer on some human oversight at this point, saying we can't just allow for algorithmic amplification of the most wild, insane theories. We can't be promoting the most popular groups because oftentimes they're terrible. And so that's where I believe that coming up with a framework to rethink how information is curated and pushed out to us is actually one of the most significant endeavors that we're going to make in kind of getting our hands around the new information technology.
And so I want to build off that a little bit, and I think there's both solutions in the platform design and platform education that I think. Sorry, in education, not platform education, platform design and education that I think will be helpful. On the platform design, and also I think we're not going to solve this with one thing. We've got to solve it from multiple directions. I think there is a role of policy as well, moderation, curation, platforms working differently. But for me, when I look at what's happening with disinformation and how it's now wired into the systems, it's in the algorithms, it's in the recommendations, it's in how the information moves, it's in who's networked to whom and who has big audiences. Changes that we make now are going to have a hard time fixing, because we're coming from a point that's already so toxic and where disinformation is right now so pervasive that it's hard to actually, it's so distorting what's happening in online spaces that it's hard to even figure out, what the signal is. And so I really think that it's going to take profound changes to those algorithms, starting over in some places, and it's going to take dissolving some of those networks, taking away the connections, to drop the accounts, but take away some of those connections, trim them, and don't let them form back, because they've been formed by gaming the system, by gaming the recommendation systems, by using automation. All of these things have formed a structure that now we can't just say we're going to fix it from here because, it's wired in, right? So I think they're going to really need some structural changes, and it's not going to be just about the design or tweaking the algorithm or tweaking, a label or something that we're seeing. I do think there's hope on the education side as well. Again, it's working with platform changes and other things, but I do see people becoming a little bit more savvy about what they're seeing. They're more aware of these things. I don't think they know what yet to do. And so how do we educate ourselves and help ourselves become healthier, more productive participants in these environments, be skeptical, but not too skeptical, figure out how we can trust and whom we can trust. I do think that's an education problem. I butt heads with others about this, because I think folks in the tech industry really think of this completely as a technical problem, but I do think that we have agency as people and that we can do better. But it's not a K through 12, and it's not a college course. This is a K through 99 problem where we have to be educating across our population to help us become more resistant and resilient to these information toxicities.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Kate. I do think that my hope is that over time, the public will get more sophisticated about what they see on the internet, and more sophisticated. SUNY at New York and Stony Brook has been running a course for a while now on the internet, on just news on the internet, and giving students ways to look at it, et cetera. I think I'm hoping that just as we are, if you look at us on advertisements, right? I mean, we're very sophisticated consumers when it comes to advertising, right? We check things out. We don't just buy the car that has the best color or the prettiest people surrounding it. We're pretty good about, looking through advertising. And my hope is that sophistication will develop with the internet as well.
Thanks. And I not to put Renee and Kate on the spot, but there's another, I'm glad we kind of transitioned to some of the civil society things that we can be doing to try and tackle this issue. And I know that you're both involved with the Election Integrity Project, I believe. And would you mind just sharing a little bit about what that is? And kind of, I think there's a sense out there, and I've talked with Fiona about this too, that there's all this disinformation online and nobody's doing anything about it, right? And it's been really great to see some of the leading, the folks at the leading edge of the research community, come together to try and at least draw some awareness to it. I don't know if one of you wants to take the lead or not, but I just wanted to give you a chance to plug what you guys are doing.
Sure. So it was one of the things that that we've really felt for a long time. Some of the reports that my colleagues at Stanford put out actually in 2018 believe that cooperation, multi-stakeholder collaboration is really one of the ways that we have to combat this. And that's because everybody has visibility into different facets of the problem. So as outside researchers, we can see certain things. We can look at information spreading across channels. We can look at narratives that are beginning to bubble up that, we see indications that velocity is increasing, virality is increasing. Platforms have visibility very deep into their own stack, but not necessarily broad across the ecosystem. Governments, so secretaries of state and election officials will see narratives beginning to spread in their communities, but don't necessarily have the technical capabilities to understand how they got there or why they're there, or to what extent it's a tree falling in the woods versus a big deal. And then there is, of course, the FBI and DHS, which have some visibility into money flows, information about foreign adversaries, different scopes of understanding the problem. And so Election Integrity Partnership was a vision of how could we build a collaborative ecosystem in which all of those stakeholders and civil society, I left them out, the extensive groups of people who see disinformation taking hold in their community and want to flag that to somebody to investigate, to understand what's happening. So I think that what we've tried to put together is really this multi-stakeholder collaborative effort where narrowly scoped to voting related misinformation and disinformation. We are evaluating narratives as they pop up, understanding their dynamics, and then working with journalists, fact checkers, platforms, and local government to understand how to combat the specific instances that are potentially having an impact. I'll let Kate maybe add to that.
No, it's just a really exciting stuff, really heavy stuff, and we're working on all cylinders. We have 4 teams at the University of Washington, 4 different analyst teams working in parallel on some of these things. And I know Stanford's got a huge group of students, and we've got some other partners at Graphica and the DFR lab, and just trying to identify mis and disinformation, analyze it, figure out where it's coming from, how it's spreading, and then communicate that, whether it's to the broader public or to a platform or someone else, to help people understand the threats.
Well, on behalf of the rest of us in our democracy, we thank you for the work that you guys are doing. And Elaine, thank you for the reminder that reality matters. It's one of the silver linings I'm going to take for this from this conversation. And most importantly of all, just thank you to all of you for sharing your insight and perspective with us today. I know I've learned a lot, and I'm kind of regretful that we only had an hour because there's so many other questions I want to ask you all. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to back over to Fiona Hill for the final panel, looking at some of the solutions about what we can actually do in terms of policy, in terms of government, to tackle this problem. So.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.